So much. I'm really stoked to be here. And my talk is about kind of metaphysics, mentors, magics, and comics. And this first image that I wanted to put up here is showing that the drawing board is a portal to another world. You know, when you're drawing, it gives you access to an entirely different parallel universe. You can put yourself into any sort of space you want. And I particularly like this image of William de Kooning's studio because it kind of shows the relationship of you to the work. And it's almost like the image on the left that he's a matador. You know, he's kind of like not really attacking the painting, but he's moving back and forth, that the image is working on all these different levels, you know, like it's again, that sort of idea of the portal. And this is Jack Kirby, the king of comics. Almost every movie that you go to these days, superhero movie, he was the primary kind of inventor of those characters. And looking at the drawing on the right, I want to talk a little bit about his creative process because I think it's really important to think about like how you're moving through space when you're doing a drawing. The career of comics pioneer Jack Kirby extended over 52 years. No other cartoon artist ever produced as many comics as Kirby. Most of his drawings were produced with a #2 Ticonderoga pencil. He drew each of his 25,000 published pages of art by starting at the upper left-hand corner and continuing until he finished at the lower right. He didn't sketch, he didn't lay out lines of perspective, he didn't erase, and sometimes he'd draw 23 pages that completely departed from the 23-page story he thought he was doing. This was a man consumed by imagination. It's important, it shows that when you're in the zone, you're inside of a different area, you know, like, and he just was able to project himself into an entirely different universe and unlock the creative process. So you can see that one of the things, I remember seeing these comics when I was a kid and just moving into this entirely different imaginary world that kind of just really blew me away. And also the other character that I like is Steve Ditko. Doctor Strange was also one of my favorite comics because he conjured up these imaginary landscapes. One of the things why I'm showing these, and I think it's important, is one of the ways we're going to have to kind of deal with this terrible environmental crisis that we're in is we're really going to have to use our imagination and think about things in entirely new ways, things that we haven't thought about. And I think breaking into these parallel universes and kind of projecting into new scenes is really an important way. One of the things I've learned about working, the hardest thing to do is to get started. And I find I just get up in my morning, I make my coffee, I sit down to the drawing table. I always make sure there's something started from the previous day, but I just sit down and I start drawing. And I think you just never know where you're going to go. But once you start, then you find that it bifurcates, that things happen and you keep kind of multiplying exponentially into these different worlds. And kind of my career or my big imagination burst happened when I was in high school because I did really bad in high school. I was dyslexic. So I was always getting sent to detention because I was drawing in class. But these are some of the images I was doing in high school where I was kind of like, I never had any idea what a landscape architect was, but I was looking at these sort of imaginary surrealistic landscapes and kind of taking them into where I might go. And my big breakthrough was when I was working at Sasaki in Miami. One of the things that angered me is that I happened to read in the Architectural Journal that Max Protek's gallery in New York City was showing architecture drawings. And one of the things that made me mad is he wasn't showing landscape architecture drawings, because I really feel that landscape architecture is an art form. So that set me on the course of trying to get my work exhibited in the same platforms as landscape architects. And after, like many years, I finally was able to do that. But in the upper left is one of my first kind of drawings where I was struggling with this idea of creating multi-viewpoints. But my big breakthrough happened when I studied the work of Garrett Ekbo. And I came to California and I was studying the California garden movement. And Garrett Ekbo talked about the garden as being walking through an abstract painting, that there is a multiplicity of viewpoints and that the landscape should be a work of art. And also in his first book that that my mother bought me when I just started to go into landscape architecture was these axonometric views that he was using, these kind of like parallel perspectives. So I embarked on doing a whole series of explorations on the right-hand side. You can see these are pen and ink drawings with watercolor washes where I'd start off and with light pencil lines and kind of jam. You know, once I would lay it out, kind of lay out a grid or a framework, I would kind of jam like spontaneous prose like Jack Kerouac and kind of move through the drawing. And I was doing a whole series of these. And you can see I'm showing these two drawings that contrast and compare. The one on the left is done with pen and ink and watercolor wash. And the one on the right is for garden and climate, where I'm taking these historical passive microclimatic devices and reconfiguring them into contemporary gardens. And for this effect, I wanted to kind of use the classic Beaux-Arts watercolor technique where you stretch the paper and you do a pencil drawing and then you watercolor on top of that. So you can kind of see the two different contrasts with ink outlines or pencil outlines, kind of like two different ways you might go. But mentors, I think all of you, it's really important to think about like, who are your mentors? You know, like what they say, when a student is ready, a teacher appears. And I was fortunate if my dad wanted to work for Disney. And I used to sit on his lap and watch him do these Disney characters. And my grandfather always made sure that I had pencils and paper to draw. It's my grandfather in the lower left. And also he built model trains for me, which I guess was my first introduction into landscape. And on the right is a painting I did in 7th grade. And we lived in Alaska, and it was an Alaska scene. And I took it into school to show my art teacher. And my mother was so excited about it. Oh, take it in, take it in. So when I came back, the art teacher looked at it, and he looked at it once and he goes, "That's a C+." And when I got home, my mom goes, what did he say? What did he say? I said, well, he gave me, he said it was a C+. My mother got so angry that she went into the principal and got him to change it to an A. But the weird thing is, when I was packing up the house and I came across this painting, it really was a C+. But it brings up kind of that belief that you have in people. Like, this is my mother on the lower right. This is her, since this is Women's Month. Like, I just wanted to pay tribute. My mother was a woman Marine. She was 5'1". She wasn't big enough to be able to enlist, but because of the war scene and what the Marines did in Guadalcanal, she joined and got a special exemption. But she was only 5 feet tall, but she filled the room. And she was quite an accomplished painter. These are some of her paintings on the left that she painted. And, like her undying belief in me, even though like I wasn't as good as I thought I was, I think really is something important that, and I carry that over into my teaching. Well, I mean, I really didn't go to art school, but I luckily grew up with Mad Magazine, and the reprints were in black and white. And I never realized that Mad Magazine was a comic because I could only buy these kind of reprints and the Valentine reprints. But these black and white drawings, like the detail made me realize that the value of a drawing is something that you can look at for 45 minutes to the length of a math class or algebra class or Spanish class, because I kept flunking those because I was looking at the drawings. But one of my first heroes was Wally Wood. They did these magnificent pen and ink drawings. It's just stunning. And My World is one of the comics I read that just made me just change my life forever, because it talked about the imagination of the science fiction comic book illustrator. And this is my room in the upper left. My mother was really worried. I got into doing these monster t-shirts and drawing these t-shirts on the upper right and upper left, inspired by Ed Big Daddy Roth doing weirdo t-shirts. And that kind of carried me into college. Well, when I got to college, I came across the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. And I came across the Wasmuth portfolio, and I came across these beautiful pen and ink drawings that really made me think about, this is organic architecture. It took me years to realize that Mary Mahoney Griffith was the actual renderer for these drawings, and she was the landscape architect for Frank Lloyd Wright. And she's really the one that kind of made him famous with these beautiful renderings that she was doing. And because she was a landscape architect doing the gardens and rendering these buildings, I really think this contributed to this kind of feeling of organic architecture. And it took me years to kind of realize that she was really the kind of powerhouse, the real renderer. And look at these. These are done with a crow quill pen. where you not a rapidograph, but you have to dip it in the ink and draw it. And you also have to make sure you don't smear it. Pretty phenomenal. So when I first started working with Sasaki Associates, I came across this drawing in Miami that Frank James had done for the Kuwaiti waterfront project. And I was totally insulted by it because to me, it was like a cartoon. And then what I've come to realize that I wish I could draw like this. The freedom of expression in this drawing, the kind of pure gestural is phenomenal. And he became my mentor. And some of the way he was working, he was kind of telling stories with these grid-like comic scenes. I mean, you can hear he's drawing almost like Jack Kirby, where he's taking his 00 rapidograph and just starting at the upper left and drawing this grid, and then just this is all drawn with one pen. And you can kind of see the spontaneous flow, the connection with the subconscious. Well, in the back of my mind, I always kind of thought I was going to be a cartoonist. And that kind of got sidetracked as I got into landscape architecture. And but I got a letter from the professor Paul Helmut, who was teaching at Colorado State University, saying that he wanted to put together a book of things that landscape architects were inspired by as children, because he wanted to make a book like artists and poets that are out there that kids could look at and see what other famous writers and poets did as kids. So I came up with this idea since I was kind of grew up around train sets, that kind of inspired me. So I did this 10-page layout. The book never appeared, never happened. So I sent the pencil layouts to Landscape Architecture magazine, and Bill Thompson wrote me back right away and said, do it. So this was kind of the beginning of my endeavor into the kind of visual narrative. And for maybe 7 years, I did a series on creative thinking for Landscape Architecture magazine, always kind of thinking that I wanted to kind of turn this into a graphic novel. Well, one of the important things about mentors and being a college student is you'll have books that change your life forever. One of the books that changed my life forever was Carlos Castaneda's Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui Way of Knowledge, which was all about looking at the landscape in an entirely new way. And after I graduated, I went out, I spent 4 months in the American Southwest studying the architecture of the Anasazi Indians, but also trying to find a mentor, someone that could kind of teach me a Yaqui way of knowledge. And of course I didn't. And it was really strange. A year later, I'd totally forgotten about this experience. And this is so zen. I went to work for Sasaki in Miami. And at that time, Miami was really the armpit of America. There was no South Beach then. I remember one afternoon kind of getting angry at what was going on in the office and walking down Calle Ocho and coming across what I thought was an abandoned bookstore. I stopped, turned around, and went inside, and there was nobody there. It was dark. And as my eyes adjusted, this little man came around the corner, handed me a book, and he says, "Here, I want you to read this, and when you're done, come back and we'll talk about it." And the irony of this is that, it's so zen when a teacher's ready, when a student's are ready, a teacher appeared. The least place I ever expected to find this, in the least place in the world, I came across a man. This relationship went on for many years. And so I wanted to kind of, with cartooning the landscape, talk about this protege-mentor relationship and about drawing as a form of consciousness and landscape architecture as a portal to another world, and also a landscape architecture as a way of kind of changing the environment. So the book is broken down into 6 comics, and instead of the bookstore, I turned it into a comic book store. So the idea is that there's the kind of mentor gives the protege a comic book. He reads it and he comes back and they have these discussions, these intellectual kind of Platonic Socratic kind of discussions of what the book is about. And I'm very happy about it. And embedded within these comic stories are sort of these transcendental messages. It's kind of like you have to read them to kind of understand them and get the message. So the idea is that there are these kind of like parallel universes, but all these kind of moral lessons within. So my creative process and how this happened. As I said, I always had in the back of my mind, I always wanted to do a graphic novel. And at this point, there were no graphic novels on landscape architecture. So on the upper left is sort of a list I took of the comics that I had done for the creative series in Landscape Architecture magazines. On the right-hand side is the train schedule from Berkeley to Davis. And driving up there to give a lecture for Liz's class, I started to sketch out these ideas. So this shows you that where does inspiration come from? It comes from like when you least expect it, but you always need to have a piece of paper ready. Here on the left, writing Bart and reading the kind of Daily Californian or the East Bay Express, you know, like somehow the type, you know, like already having something written on the paper, I started to sketch ideas out for different stories and different things. So you can kind of see my creative process of working back and forth and keeping track of these little scraps of paper and putting them together. The idea began to solicit for the comic I wanted to do called Our World, which is about landscape architecture, which is parallel with Wally Wood's My World. And this is a leaflet. This is a flyer for Comic-Con. One of my good friends actually got to go to Comic-Con, and she gave me all this material. So all I got was the schedule. But on the schedule, on the BART system, reading the schedule, the spark of kind of imagination happened for the comic that I wanted to do on Our World. So as I started to lay it out, I worked back and forth between word and image. So here I'm writing down how I want it to work. And on the right-hand side, I'm doing little thumbnail sketches of how that's going to work. And then I kind of explore out, I wanted to use the kind of stone circle at the village of Salisbury in England as kind of a parallel with the modern kind of community kind of apartments that are kind of in a similar form. And I'm trying to, you know, contrast and compare. So this is the next step in laying out a visual narrative, is to kind of, you lay out all the pages, how the pages are going to work. It's kind of cinematography, like a movie director is going to kind of lay out the pages and move back and forth. And you're kind of looking, the overview to the visual novel, I think, is really important. So this is how I begin to work on Our World and all the other comic strips in cartooning the landscape. I work on 8.5 by 11 kind of canary yellow paper because it has a really nice feel to it. So I'll sketch those thumbnails out, then I'll enlarge them to 11 by 17, which is sort of the standard comic book format. And then I'll lay tracing paper over that and work it out. And then what I do is kind of like I move into this hybrid mode, where I take the pencil sketch on tracing paper and I scan it on my scanner with dropout blue lines. And then I print that out on Bristol paper, and then I ink it, and then I scan it again, drop out the blue lines, and then I print that out on Bristol paper, print that out on a hot press watercolor paper. And then I have something that I can begin to ink. So on the left-hand side, you see the kind of my test strip. I will take, before I do the final watercolor, I'll Xerox it on cardstock, and I will test out all my colors. And then when I kind of have a sense of confidence for the coloring scheme, then I will go in on the right-hand side, and you can see that's Our World. And I'm really excited about this because Our World, it talks about like what landscape architects can do. It kind of transforms kind of the environment and how we can transform the environment. And I'm pretty pleased with it. And it's also a nice tribute to my mentor, Wally Wood, who I learned to draw from. So I was pretty excited about that. And this is a further example of a cardstock watercolor on the left where I'm testing the colors, and on the right-hand side is the final color. This is a little more color than I usually test out, but this is like the third comic I did for Landscape Magazine. I was a little nervous about it. So I wanted to kind of finish up with this sequential narrative because I think there's something starting to happen that I'm seeing as I give crits around the country. Students are starting to use the visual narrative of the graphic novel as sort of environmental storytelling. And this is from Cartooning the Landscape, but I created these two kids. It's a protagonist, and this is the kind of tree circus near Santa Cruz, where this man spent his life kind of hybridizing these trees into different forms. But you can see, using this sort of Garrett-Ekbo axonometric, you can kind of follow along and move through the images. Now, this is a book I had in high school that really affected my graphic design because this is a book cover. And it gets the whole idea across of the whole book. You have the two protagonists at the top, you have the scientist, you have the road at the bottom. It tells the whole story. The art ties everything together. So a lot of my work is about telling a story in one image. On the left, somehow I lucked out and won this cartoon competition for the East Bay Express about the kind of sudden oak death syndrome and the scientists that were working at Berkeley Labs to fight it. And on the right-hand side is a one-page spread I did for Ground Up magazine that kind of uses that whole idea of being visual storytelling, being able to tell a story in one drawing, but also, like when I was in high school, being able to look at something for 45 minutes and being drawn into the image. And this is also from Cartooning the Landscape, where I'm kind of telling, I have these two protagonists moving through the whole history of kind of landscape architecture, kind of the sacred qualities of these kind of drawings where they're moving through the landscape, so you can find them, follow them as they move through these different kind of styles of landscape. I mean, landscape garden design is to have garden is to have faith in the future. And all the great cultures in the past, their gardens were their representations of what they thought the cosmos was. So this is kind of like searching, moving through the garden and kind of finding their own sense of consciousness at the very upper right-hand side. So you can see them following through the level. So it seems like I've been doing a lot of book covers for different people, but Randy Hester and David Della Pena were doing this book, Design is Democracy, and they wanted me to do the cover. So, but that meant reading the whole damn book. So I had to work my way through the manuscript. But, you know, like I always go to Top Dog in Berkeley to get a hot dog. And, you know, I was at an impasse, and how was I going to pull this, you know, like it was like a variety of editors doing this, you know, a variety of writers, you know, everybody's doing a different chapter. How was I going to put this together? So I've been going to Top Dog for 20 years and sitting at the left-hand side. And right over the left-hand side is this drawing on the right that was done in the 1920s. And I looked at this, and that's where my idea came from. That's how I was going to tell the story and tie all these different things together into a visual narrative. And on the left, this is the cover. So it shows like how the whole idea of the book was knitting it together, like how you move through all of these different things and all of these different ideas that the different contributors had to the book into one image. They liked it so much, they said, well, we're going to break it down and use it for each chapter. But then they said, Chip, can we sum up? Can you put a mirror? Can you put it like, do it in reflection? So I had to take my drawing on the left, hold a mirror up to it, and draw the drawing on the left of what you would be seeing behind you. So that's a first for me. We're doing a drawing, you know, in reflection of what you saw, what you saw as you move through the space. This is one of my friends, you know, like that I shoot pool with. That's how I got into the Google Doodle about the pool player. But Matt Krunchek is the director, the animation director for Google Doodle. But he had an exhibition with 3 other friends. They go out for years. They've been going out together and doing plein air paintings on the weekends. And they had an exhibition of their plein air paintings. And he wanted me to do kind of an introduction, a drawing introduction. If you have a chance to Google the Earth Day that he did in 2018 for Jane Goodall, to me, this animation says it all about what we can do as a way of getting our ideas across. It's really brilliant, you know, the way it shows the kind of whole inner workings and inner network. Well, this is my process for working in my thumbnail sketch on the left. I kind of wanted to show that he's a part of this great tradition of plein air painting, going back to all the great outdoor painters, you know, and kind of coming through. So it kind of ties it through. And unfortunately, you know, this was exhibited in the drawing. This is one of my recent paintings that I was doing about the pandemic. I was kind of like thinking about it in my sketchbook on the upper left. I carry these tiny little sketchbooks with me about this size. This is where I get a lot of my ideas in these little books. So I was writing down the ideas, and next to that is my sketch. I wanted to make a parallel with Persephone going into the underworld, you know, dying, you know, like giving up all sense of hope, and then coming out into this transformative world, because that's kind of what we're going through. You know, we're in hell right now, and we're going out into this new world, and it's going to be changed forever. You know, something new is going to happen. So I did a whole series of this, and you know, like I did a whole bunch of prints, and they're selling like hotcakes. You know, so for me, I hope the pandemonium keeps going on because I'll sell more paintings. So, that's. And then I was asked to do the cover for the history of Goldgate Park, which again, it's a whole history, you know, 100-year history of the park. So I did all these images, but the author hated the drawing, but the publisher loved the drawing. So what he did as a way of getting around it, he put a kind of a transparent cover on top of my drawing and published it that way. So I thought that was kind of cool. But the image on the right is kind of showing kind of the major elements that took place in this park over the last 100 years. So kind of in summary, I think we're right down, you know, like I only wish I was in Guelph right now, because what I believe in working really, really hard and then having a good time and celebrating. I hope someday I get up there and we can go out and have a dram or a Guinness at a local Irish pub and sit around and draw. This was in Edinburgh, which that was a great experience. As you know, the whiskey there is pretty darn good. But anyway, so this is kind of a quick overview of my creative process. I mean, just to summarize, I think it's really, really important to kind of be able to learn from other people, to be able to have a mentor. And also, when a teacher is ready, a student appears, but when a student is ready, when a teacher is ready, students will appear. So I think it's a really great opportunity in teaching to kind of be giving things back from what I learned. So I can take questions. It's at another